thank you all for coming. And it's so strange, right? This is my, 26th year here on campus, and it feels, it's just weird. I said it feels like finals week, that like it used to feel on campus. You wouldn't see anybody around, but the rest of the time it'd be busy. That's what it feels like. I was like, this is so strange. But thank you so much for coming. We're so glad you guys are here in person, and we're glad you're watching if you're watching this later, or now. I guess it's live streaming too. So this, just a little introduction. So my name is Chris Moon, if you don't know me. I teach in the early childhood education program, and parent education also, and education major as well. And we have a grant called the Early Achievers Grant through the state board that provides funding for child care providers who are going back to school to get their certificates so that they can meet the requirements for their job in child care. So we pay for scholars. I think we have 60 right now. And so as part of that grant, they did an extension grant to help us be more responsive to Indigenous pathway, to create an Indigenous pathway for our early childhood folks and work with the local tribes to do that. And so as part of that work, we've been doing some work in our program around that. We read a great book called The Circle of Courage. Reclaiming Youth around the Circle of Courage, which is a Native approach to working with kids at risk. We had a great time doing that, and then we are bringing this speaker to campus, and we thought as long as we're bringing him for us, we wanted to offer that to the faculty as well. So we're really glad you're here joining us, and that's a little history of that. And Anne-Marie is our leader of our grant, and so she is the connection to Joaquin, and is going to introduce him. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Marie. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Hi, it is wonderful to see people in person. I'd like to start today by reciting our land acknowledgement for South Puget Sound Community College. South Puget Sound Community College is located on the ancestral lands of the Stay Chass Band of the Squaxin Island Tribe and Nisqually Island Tribe, who have long been stewards of the region's waters, plants, and animals. The southernmost point of the Salish Sea, these lands were, and still are, a place of gathering, trade, and community for many Coast Salish peoples. We recognize that all who are not Salish peoples are visitors here. We commit to join these peoples to share their history, build relationships, increase representation, and restore the living world around us. In the education department, we also recognize that acknowledging is the first step in an important process of welcoming BIPOC identities into our classrooms and on campus. And we're hoping to take more steps forward in what we learn here from Joaquin. Dr. Joaquin Munoz is an assistant professor of Indigenous Education at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He grew up on the Pascua Yaqui Indian Reservation in Arizona, where he learned early on about the complicated issues of race, culture, history, and oppression. His research focuses on Indigenous education and teacher education, with a focus on supporting teachers to be effective when working with diverse Indigenous populations. Through cultural awareness, critical pedagogy practices, and cultural responsive pedagogy, Munoz has spent the past decade developing skills for his work by using methods that include Indigenous Circle Work, the theater of the oppressed, various forms of art, dialogue, and literacy tools. He also consults with schools internationally, working on anti-racist education, cultural competency, and culturally responsive approaches in the US, Germany, Israel, and Mexico, and we're so excited to have him here in Washington working with us at SPSCC. I had the wonderful opportunity to work with Joaquin in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the teacher education program at Augsburg University. Just blocks away from what is now known internationally as George Floyd Square. So he's been in the thick of the race issues in our country, and I would like to welcome him, so please join me. Thank you. I'm just going to pull up your slide now.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. This is weird. People again. Like, I don't even recognize human beings without little squares around me. It's such a strange thing. And I've got a whole, let me start by saying I don't like podiums. This is not my preferred method of engagement, but I've got a bunch of loose papers everywhere. I don't want to lose stuff. And as soon as, I don't mean to intrude or eavesdrop, but I do listen to people's conversations, and I was picking up little drops here and there of things that are on people's minds. And as soon as I start hearing that, I start changing everything that I'm planning on doing. So I'm going to do my best to adhere to what I had originally planned for, with a couple of noted additions. Just to get started though, can I check in with folks who are here? How many of you are in some way, shape, or form involved in the education process? Whether you're a teacher here at SPCC or at SPSCC, wherever you're at. Are you teaching, educating, working with young people, older young people, younger old people, whoever it is you're working with? Okay, we're all in the education field. Excellent. That's all going to come in really handy as we go forward, because a lot of what I do in terms of engaging teachers and teacher educators is I think pedagogically. I look at the world from a pedagogical standpoint, and everywhere I go and everything that I do, I process through the lens of thinking, what does this teach me? What can I use from this to teach other people? And so I want to spend a lot of time going over a lot of terminology. You're going to see a lot of words up here, and I'm not super concerned about you getting every single word that I put up here. What I am going to do is ask you to sort of engage impressions. I'm going to ask you to read things and reflect on them and respond to them. And we're not here to do a very hugely didactic thing where I'm passing information back and forth. This is really about your experience of impressions. Because so much of what we're seeing in the world right now, the conversation that I promise I wasn't eavesdropping on was folks talking about enrollment levels for the coming semester, I swear. The Chronicle of Higher Ed, I don't know how many of you subscribe to the Chronicle of Higher Ed, had this blockbuster article about 2 new ways to solve the engagement problem. And I love it when the Chronicle gets a hold of things because it thinks it's figured things out that no one's ever known. And then you go and talk to any educator and they're like, yeah, I could have told you that on Tuesday. The 2 new strategies are personal engagement and relevance. Can you show students how whatever it is you're talking about connects to them in some personal level? That's new, in case you didn't get it. Write that down. If you're taking notes, write that down. The second one is active inquiry engagement. Not didactic teaching, but have students get involved in things. Brand new. We never knew. Now you know. So this is going to be kind of a balance of both of those. I'm going to try to get, like I said, there's a big information dump that's going on here, but I'm going to try to make this personally relevant to you. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of active inquiry and engagement, and then we're going to use this to leverage, for those of you who are coming to the workshop afterwards, some of this is going to sort of roll into the workshop in a very nice sort of fluid way. How many of you, I'm going to ask you a couple questions before we continue on. How many of you have heard the term settler? How many of you are familiar with it? How many of you feel like you could give a good, solid definition of what settler is? How many of you are, kind of, sort of, maybe? All right. How many of you have heard the term settler colonial or settler colonialism? How many of you feel like you could give a good, solid definition of that term? Maybe, kind of, sort of. All right. How many of you have heard of race? Good, solid definition? More so, but still there's a few. Okay. How many of you have heard the term critical race theory? Good, solid definition of what that is? Kind of, sort of. How many of you have heard of critical race theory, and generally what you're getting is kind of like, this is bad. It's like the way people are talking about it makes it sound kind of demonic or devilish. How many of you have heard the term oppression or anti-oppression? How many of you feel like you could give a good, solid definition of what anti-oppression is? Okay. All of these things, for those of you who have read about this, who have studied it, who have listened to it in podcasts, who have heard people like me talk to you about it, will know that all of these things are intricately connected. That none of these things happens in a vacuum, that none of these things happens without having impacts of the one on the other. So when we talk about settler colonialism, we have to talk about race. When we talk about race, we have to talk about critical race theory. When we talk about critical race theory, we have to talk about indigeneity. When we talk about indigeneity, we have to talk about settlers and settler colonialism. And that would be nice if that's all we had to do. Except, when we talk about settler colonialism, we also have to talk about oppression. which means we have to talk about oppression of various gender expressions, which means we have to talk about oppression of various socioeconomic expressions, religious expressions, neurotypical expressions. There's so many different things that we need to talk about, which is why I'm so fond of working with educators, because educators, in my experience, both personally and professionally, are the most creative problem solvers I've ever run into. Just hands down. There's nobody better at it. And weirdly, I think if teachers were in charge of more things, things would be going a lot better. Say that when you see a bunch of 3-year-olds running around. So, that's where we're going today. I would like to begin with my own introduction and my own land acknowledgement. My name is Joaquin Munoz. I use he, him, his pronouns. I was born in Arizona, raised on the Pascua Yaqui Tribe in Tucson, Arizona, and so I claim my identity as being an indigenous and Mexican person from Arizona. And I would like to take a moment to offer a land acknowledgement that was authored by a friend of mine and colleague, Melissa Horner, who is Turtle Mountain Métis, and is a PhD student at in sociology at the University of Missouri. Excuse me. And she offers this opening statement, and I asked for her permission, and she gave me permission to share it. I would like to offer an acknowledgement of the indigenous peoples who practiced and continue to practice culture, ceremony, and life on this sacred ecology of lands and waters that we convene on today. Specifically, I wish to acknowledge the Squaxin Island Tribe and the Nisqually Indian Tribes of Washington and the Musqueam peoples of Vancouver, where I come from. These communities, their past and present peoples, all of whom have been impacted by removals, reservations, and colonial borders. In acknowledging these peoples and these ancestrally connected homelands and waters, it is important to recognize that our ability to have and attend and be in spaces like this is due in part to colonial policies and the practices of genocide and cultural erasure. And in making this statement, I hope to create a space, even if it's just for a few moments, to disrupt these colonizing practices and continue to make visible Native peoples and places, both historically and contemporarily, as part of my work towards tribal sovereignty, equity, and transformation. And in the spirit of acknowledging peoples indigenous to the land, it's also important to acknowledge contemporary contributions of indigenous peoples. So for example, when folks that I know come to Vancouver, I always direct them to go to the Bill Reid Gallery, which is a collection of indigenous art by the famed Haida artist Bill Reid, as well as a collection of art done by contemporary indigenous folks. And in this way, we break away from one piece of the colonial mindset that tells us that indigenous peoples and their experiences exist in the past. It's something that happened way long ago. And it's nothing that we really have to be thinking about right now. It's important for us, if we are interested in thinking about these processes and disrupting some of these processes, to think about how we consider, understand, and know indigeneity both in the past, in the present, but also in the future. As you're able to, and as you're comfortable to, I'd like you to take a second to just close your eyes. Okay? And as you're comfortable and as you're able to, I want you to take a deep breath. And then I want you to open your eyes, and I want you to locate yourself spatially. Look around you, look behind you, look to the side, look at your feet, look forward, look around. Locating ourselves spatially, locating the people around us spatially. This is still a very weird thing. Think about how long you've been existing in two-dimensional space. It can feel very strange and even in a sense very vulnerable for some folks to be around people right now. We've kind of in a way forgotten what it's like to be around people, right? And given the context of where the United States is in terms of questions around safety and security for all different kinds of folks right now, it can be really hard to feel safe in a place outside of your home. So the degree that you're able to locate yourself spatially, to look around you, and to the best of our ability, get a sense that right now we're as safe as we can be. And that's important, because a lot of the things that we're going to be discussing today are not the easiest topics to talk about. They have content in there that is that might make you feel some kind of way. right? Depending on how you identify, you might have a particular experience of hearing some of the topics that we're going to be discussing. Depending on how you understand and what you've learned, what you know and what you don't know, this can be a little discomforting. So I want you to have that in mind, but also take care of yourself and think about what you need. And if you need to get up and walk outside for a little bit, if you need to get around and take some breaths while you walk around outside, feel free to get up and go. Don't ask any permission. I'm perfectly fine with that. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to spend some time thinking about terminology. There's a lot of language and a lot of words that are already on here. But as we go along, I'm going to introduce you to a lot of terms. I'm going to do my best to give you some nuance to some of these terms. Because oftentimes, what we end up encountering when we hear words like race, racism, critical race theory, settler, colonial, what we end up getting are these kind of simplified buzzwords. And those aren't helpful to what we're trying to accomplish as educators, because our job is to always complicate things. Our job is to present an idea and then say, hey, well, here's the 8 reasons why that idea is the best ever, and also why it's completely wrong. It's our job, that's what we do. And so I'm going to try to, along with presenting some of the terminology here, I'm going to try to give you a bit of context for where some of the terminology is, where it comes from, what it means, how it works, and how we can think about it. And most importantly, because remember, the Chronicle already told us the 2 years, right? How to make this relevant to you. And I want to start by giving a brief shout out to some of my favorite folks, my academic foremothers and forefathers. There might be a couple of faces up here you recognize. Kevin Kumashiro, Bettina Love is up here, Thomas King is up here, Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson, who I draw on very, very heavily, are up here, as well as a few other names and faces. Marie Baptiste, a couple other folks who recognize. And I always think it's important to situate the work that I do in the work of other folks, because I also don't want to present myself as like, I invented this stuff. You never, thank God you hired me, because you never would have figured this out. Yeah, no, I'm a nice facilitator and a good conduit for information, but I didn't invent any of these things. I'm just bringing them together in what I hope is a somewhat palatable package. And I want to start our investigation with Marie Baptiste. 2019, Decolonizing Education. Her text is specific to the Canadian context, but I would argue that it's required reading for any person working in education in any place in the world. And if you're working in K-12 schools, chapter 5, 6, and 7 is like, don't be around kids until you've read those chapters. A forced assimilation plan. Imagine the consequence of a powerful ideology that positions one group as superior and gives away First Nation people's lands and resources and invites churches and other administrative agents to inhabit their homeland while negating their very existence. Imagine how uncertain a person is whose success is only achieved by a complete makeover of themselves, by their need to learn English and the polished rules and habits that go with that identity. Marie Baptiste, 2019. What's a word here that sort of strikes you? What's a word in this that sort of jumps out at you?
Forced assimilation.
Forced assimilation. What else?
Negating.
Negating.
The makeover, like complete makeover.
Complete makeover. What else?
Identity.
Identity.
Polished. Your attempts
Mm-hmm.
aren't valid unless they are as if you were in this culture and
Mm-hmm.
from outside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They are thrust into a society that does not want them to show too much success or too much Indian identity, losing their connections to their land, family, and community when they have to move away as there is no work in their homeland. Assimilation. Assimilation. It's a really weird word because in the context of the United States, we have this really, really, really powerful discourse around individuality, right? The rugged individual, right? The don't tell me what to do, I have my rights. And this is not an attempt to smear and admonish any particular political ideology, because virtually the entire spectrum carries this as one of its core central tenets, this idea of me, what I want, or what my family wants, or what we get, right? And sometimes it extends a little beyond that, but this notion of the individual, of the one. That sort of would seem to stand in contrast to this idea of assimilation, right? That if it's individuality, then you be you, go do what you want to do. Like, you wouldn't need to conform to anything. Except we also know, through years and years of experience of watching the news and listening to Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit folks talk about their experiences, that let us know that that kind of assimilation is in many ways necessary for their survival, literally. So when we talk about colonization and decolonization, and within the context of thinking about indigeneity, we need to have these two ideas in mind, that we have a discourse that sort of teaches this idea about individuality, about rights and freedoms and the things that everyday individual citizens are allowed to have, when those individual citizens conform to a very particular kind of identity work. When they're not doing that, they're not doing it right, and something needs to be done. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. And by the way, as I mentioned before, this also extends beyond our definitions of just thinking about concepts that deal with indigeneity, because colonialism and settler colonial systems have done a lot to impact or enliven or even be responsible for processes of enslavement, patriarchy, toxic patriarchy in particular, and the violence contained within the dialectic, the dynamics of this and that, us and them, self and other. And this also applies to gendered violence. This also applies to oppression of many different marginalized groups of people. And so, where I want you to start, I'm not going to make you do this out loud, but where I want you to start is by thinking about, go deep into your memory banks, go back into your data banks. And I want you to think about what you've been taught about indigenous peoples. But I need you to go even beyond that level. I need you to go beyond that surface, because oftentimes, almost without fail, Washington, you seem to do a little bit better given some of the interactions that I've had with folks. But by and large, when I talk to communities and when I talk to groups of people in the United States, when I ask about what people know about indigenous peoples, the most popular answer is nothing. Silence. Don't know anything. The second most popular answer is the Trail of Tears. And not really knowing what that is, just knowing that it was a thing and it was bad. But we don't really know how or why. It was bad. Ronald Takaki, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, James Lowen, Abraham X. Kendi are really great resources to help us examine some of these processes and some of these ideas. I especially recommend Ronald Takaki's book, A Different Mirror, Multicultural History of the United States. He does an amazing job of unpacking so many of the different identities that are contained within this rich fabric of the United States, and looking at all of the experiences that they had, particularly in relation to political structures and systems. Land acknowledgements are a really interesting thing, because they help to situate an understanding and a history, and at the same time, when done in maybe not the best ways, they can feel and sound very performative. They can feel and sound like, oh, that's a very nice thing that you said, but so what? And while I agree with that position to a certain extent, I also think it's important that the land acknowledgement actually occur. Because we're giving a voice, right? Think about what happens in the process of saying the names of the communities here out loud. What happens to you? What happens to the people around you? I've never actually done this. I should do this one of these days. Like, do a little anonymous poll with folks to find out what is your emotional experience when you hear the names of tribes said out loud. Because you're acknowledging a history, you're acknowledging an experience, you're acknowledging a trajectory over time. And whether you like it to or not, it sort of nudges you into directions that you might not necessarily want to go. For example, one of the inquiry projects that I have students engage with is to find out who were the people on the land where you are right now. And our land acknowledgement just told us who this land belongs to, who is here. Where are they now?
Here.
Do we know where exactly? Do we know how they got there? Do we know if they got to that place because they wanted to be there or not? Do we know what kinds of actions or activities were enacted in order to make sure that the people who may or may not be here are now in the place that they may or may not be? Right? Like, you start to have this sort of cascade of thinking that goes on, and you can ignore it if you want to, but at the same time, like, you've now heard the story. And as Thomas King loves to say, you now cannot say, 10 years from now, I would have lived my life differently if I hadn't heard that story, because you just heard that story. If they are somewhere else, where'd they go? How did they get there? What was it like then versus what is it like now? And can we say anything about their trajectories for the future? Because one of our favorite things, and by favorite I mean it's the thing that we do the most often when we think about indigeneity, is we think about the past, we think about what happened before, we think about a long time ago. Sometimes we think about the present, but really often don't have a vision or a thought for what happens in the future for indigenous peoples. Because settler colonial logics, and we'll talk about that in a minute, sets up this idea that indigenous people have to go somewhere in order for settlers to continue. Where do they have to go? They have to go away. They don't really care where they go, they just have to go away. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Three terms that we're going to spend some time with are settler colonialism. We're going to look at the term settler itself, and then I'm going to spend the most time thinking about this idea of settler colonial logics. Because honestly, I think this is the one that's the most important and also the one that is the most challenging for folks. This is from Lohman and Baker, Settler. This book, I have it in my backpack, I'm happy to show it to you later. This book is also, I would argue, required reading. It's written for the context of Canada. But Lohman and Baker do a wonderful job of structuring an argument and structuring the description of settler colonialism, and settler colonial processes that I think every person is required reading for everybody. We stand at a crossroads where there is at least some willingness to admit that colonization happened, that it had devastating impacts on indigenous nations and communities. Trail of Tears. I don't really know what it means, but Trail of Tears. It was bad, I think. And we're even, to a certain extent, willing to address the idea that a colonial legacy persists in the present in the form of socioeconomic inequality, racism and discrimination, and political marginalization of indigenous communities. But even then, we can sometimes be a little reluctant. Because sometimes we like to frame the idea of indigenous people as being disenfranchised from participating in national politics as a function of, again, that individual will or desire. They're not showing up because they don't want to. I hear this about young people a lot too. That really annoys the hell out of me. Like, young people, they just don't want to. Right? It's hard when you've been disenfranchised over a number of years in both very explicit and violent ways, but also in very implicit and not so violent ways. Anybody remember the last election? CNN was doing reporting on racial demographics of who had voted, and they got roasted. They were reporting on Black, African American folks who had voted. They were reporting on Latino, Latina, Latinx folks who had voted. They were reporting on Asian folks who had voted. Does anybody remember the last category? Something else. I mean, I have to laugh at that because it's just funny. Go look on native TikTok and see what they did. CNN did not survive the night well. What we come away from thinking about and understanding Lohman and Baker are these ideas of settler settler colonialism and settler colonial logics. Settler might be the most central because it identifies an identity that is contained within every one of us. If you are not from the place that you live, and by that I mean if your people are not indigenous to the place that you live in, and by that I mean you can't trace your ancestry, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, the archaeological record keeps pushing it back further and further, 50,000 years. If your people came from somebody else, somewhere else, you're a visitor here. I call myself a settler scholar, because even as I identify as an indigenous person, Washington and Vancouver is not my indigenous home. My indigenous home is Arizona and Mexico. So I live personally as an indigenous person within this spectrum of settler, indigenous, settler, colonial. And what's important to consider in the ways that this definition has evolved and changed over time is, again, the central idea of historical versus contemporary. When we think about colonial and when we think about colonies, we generally tend to think about the past again. Right? We think about the 13 colonies and people wearing knickers and funny hats and powdered wigs. Like that's what we envision when we think about colonial. We don't think about colonization as a process that occurs today. Right? It was an event. And oftentimes we think, for those of us who are a little bit more, a little bit more well-versed in history, we think, well, that's a bummer. That's really unfortunate. It's really sad that happened, and darn that genocide. But what are you going to do? It was bound to happen. If we didn't do it, someone else was going to do it, right? There's this language of inevitability that it had to happen. There was no other way it could happen. And settler colonial logics helps to uphold that notion, right? That not only does the process occur, colonization, it changes a little bit because with colonization of places like Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and other places, the folks who came, instead of what we generally are accustomed to when we think about colonial processes where resources are extracted from the land and returned to the originating country, something different happened. The settlers decided to stay. And the resource that was extracted, or the resource that was leveraged, became land. And then suddenly, our relationship and our understanding of land switched. Suddenly, the idea of living within an ecology and understanding that ecology for ceremonial, spiritual, and sustainability purposes went away. And the idea of land as a resource, land as ownership, land as property, suddenly became the orienting point. And by the way, this is enshrined, not only in the Constitution, but in treaties and in documents that predate the Constitution, well before. So it's very odd for me to hear arguments about indigenous rights. It's really odd for me to hear people make arguments about treaties and things like that when those documents predate the most sacred document of this country. We'll talk more about that later. Settler colonial logics, as I mentioned before, is to me the most central one, and I think the one that has the greatest implication for educators. Because settler colonial logics really help us think about the constructs of mind, how we think about things, how we respond to things, how we make sense of things. We sometimes call them habits of mind or beliefs of mind. Sometimes in education we refer to them as competencies or professional, what's the word? Predispositions, whatever it is, right? Thinking about these modules in our mind that shape the way we think about reality, right? And within the process of colonialism, settler colonialism, and settler identity, mindsets and beliefs and practices of mind are inculcated. We get ideas of what we believe about all kinds of things, how we respond and believe about all kinds of things. And then, the most interesting part is that those ideas then become so clearly communicated that they start to seem to be natural, right? That whole inevitability thing, right? That when you have a logic in mind that says an entire continent was not peopled by communities living their lives, living cycles of their lives over generations, but rather this sort of untouched primeval, virginal land that was just waiting for somebody to come along and put it to good use, because obviously the people who were here were not being industrious, productive human beings by letting all of this land go to waste. So we start to see these powerful shifts in beliefs and understandings. I'm going to throw some philosophy words at you. Again, I don't really care if you get the words, I just want you to have the concepts in mind. Ontology is shifted. Right? Our understanding about what we believe about what is real and what isn't real. Our epistemology, what we think about our knowledge of knowing about reality. Our axiology, what we consider to, or what we value or what we consider to be valuable. All of these pieces start to shift in response to this set of logics that's built to do something. Right? It's built to perpetuate its own logic. The other piece we'll add in, and we'll look at this a little bit more closely when we get into our workshop time for those of you who are coming to the workshop, is our social position. Right? Our social positioning in relation to socioeconomics, our social positioning in terms of skin color, our social positioning in terms of our identity as neurodivergent, our social positioning in terms of ability. All different kinds of pieces start to come in that begin to form and shape how we understand reality. One thing I didn't say at the beginning of this was I usually preface anything that I do like this with a disclaimer that this is not debate space. And that's partly for my own safety, because I don't feel like debating anybody. Like, that's not my thing. If you want to, I'll come and you need to pay me way more to come and argue. Right? But also because in the debate space, we're not really talking about some of the deeper underpinning issues that are at hand. Epistemology, ontology, axiology, social positioning. That when a debate happens, think about like, anytime on NPR you hear like the what is it, A1, A3, I don't remember, the little debate thing, and someone's for and someone's against. Very rarely do they stop and ask, so can you explain to us a little about your social positioning as a heterosexual cisgender male, white male, and how that affects the way you're arguing for the argument that you're making? Right? That never happens. It happens if you're another, but it doesn't happen if you're a heterosexual cisgender white male. And that's not jumping on heterosexual cisgender white males in any sense, as much as it is talking about, when we think about these structures, what is considered normal, regular, natural, acceptable, and what is not. Okay. Which brings us to the idea of standpoint. This is a methodology book. Indigenous Statistics. By the way, this is the only book I've ever read that actually made me wish I'd been a mathematician. Indigenous Statistics, Walter and Anderson. Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson are both Indigenous folks. I can't tell you the names of their tribes right now, I apologize. But they have this 2013 text called Indigenous Statistics. It's a wonderful little 6-chapter book. And the most important thing that gets communicated in the entirety, and by the way, they go through, anybody in here familiar with stats? ANOVA's, T-analysis, I'm so proud of you because I can't. See how I am so unversed I can't even make up terminology for it. That's how bad I am at this. What they communicate is this really central idea that in their process of understanding and analyzing and trying to make sense of realities and making sense of statistical analysis, one of the first things they talk about is that any form of statistical analysis is based in bias. Right? And they don't mean that in a bad way or a negative way per se. What they're saying is your social positioning, your axiology, your ontology, your epistemology, all form everything before you even come to the theory that leads you to make an analysis of what's going on. Which is why I said this is not a debate space. Because what I'm trying to communicate to you is my vision and my understanding of these ideas of settler, colonial logics from my epistemology, ontology, axiology, and my standpoint. If you don't occupy any of those pieces alongside with me, and again, this is not an attack, if you don't occupy those spaces with me, we can't, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like the idea that settler colonialism perpetuates beyond the establishment of the 13 colonies in the United States, if you agree that that's where colonialism ended, we can't really talk. And I'm not trying to be a jerk, I'm like, we can't really talk, right? In the same way, anytime we hear any kind of description about, what is the Chronicle, what's the best new approach for educating students? If your epistemology, ontology, axiology, and social positioning argues that children are empty vessels, think Freire and the banking model of education, right? Empty vessels that are just waiting for this didactic interaction where I stuff things into your brain, and I take the position that they are socially constructing knowledge with other people around. They're like, the conversation's kind of over, right? I won, but the conversation's over. The fact that the debate and the question around social position, axiology, ontology, and epistemology exists when the other is present, but does not exist when the other is not present. And the most important piece of that is this understanding that who we are, the values that underpin our concept of self, our perspectives on the world and our own position within it, our realities and our understandings of how knowledge is constructed and construed and constructed are each part of the complex puzzle involving exploring the underpinnings of methodology or teaching. Right? That every decision we've ever made about approaching children, organizing classrooms, assignments to give, the way we do or do not decide to build a particular kind of classroom culture or class atmosphere, whether you're working with big older kids or little older kids, whoever it is you're working with, right? All of those decisions are informed by these pieces of your methodology or your teaching standpoint. Right? And to ask ourselves, how often do we interrogate that? How often do we go back and think, no, I didn't even realize I was getting my epistemology everywhere. I might want to think about doing something about that. We've often been very fond of thinking about solving problems using multiculturalism. I have nothing against multiculturalism, except as often and as frequently as it has been co-opted, just about as almost any other terminology or resistance movement within education has been, that it often gets co-opted and sort of watered down to be palatable to the most people possible. One of the citations that I'll get to a little bit later on is by Tuck and Yang. It's from a piece from 2012 called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And one of the things that they decry, and we've been seeing it more and more over the last 3 years, is people talking about decolonization. And what they're really talking about is multiculturalism. But they don't realize they're talking about multiculturalism, but they're calling it decolonization. The project and the praxis on which it relies depends upon teachers who will take interruptive aim at the settler colonial logics that pervade the spaces where they live and work, most especially schools, where liberalism conceals inconvenient truths that would otherwise unsettle productively the lie that is America. When we think about the logics that we have in place, so go back to that mental model of my standpoint that is built out of my axiology, my ontology, my epistemology, and my social position. This creates my standpoint. How often do we actively and intentionally, and I would argue in community with other people, how often do we examine that and critique it? How often do we really look at ourselves and ask ourselves questions about what am I doing and why am I doing that? And why am I doing that way versus any other way? And that's not to say that the way you're doing things is wrong or bad or causing any harm or anything like that, but how often do we ask ourselves, how am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why did I decide to do it that way? What's the impetus that caused me to go in that direction versus any other direction? What Grande and Anderson from the 2017 piece ask us to consider is that not only are we responsible for developing practices that illuminate these standpoints, our axiology, ontology, epistemology, social position. It's not enough that we're looking at engaging education that illuminates those ideas. And as we're fond of in education, often we'll bring in these other perspectives or these other ideas, right? Folks will often think if I put some brown names in my reading list, I'm good to go. Right? How often are we doing that without taking a critical look at our own stances? How often are we doing that without taking a critical vision of what we're assuming to be true or real or natural, and not seeing potentially that it could cause harm to other people? And I'll give kind of a silly and sort of benign and maybe just a little creepy example. It's from me. I was with my partner at an Ann Taylor. She was looking for dresses or something. And I was standing there just occasionally giving her offhanded comments about what she should buy, and generally I was asking her to buy the more garish stuff, like, of course, everybody needs a pleather bodysuit. Anyway, there was another person standing next to me, I assume was a female, going through some clothing, and I just noticed that there seemed to be a sort of a pattern to the clothes that she was looking at and then pushing aside, clothes that she was considering, and then clothes that she was moving and pushing aside. That's the creepy part, like I'm watching this because there seemed to be this rhythmic pattern, like check, 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 and my brain just started going, like, what is going on there? And then I noticed two things simultaneously. The first thing that I noticed was that any time she moved by a piece of clothing that had any kind of clasp or button or anything that sort of had like interlocking or interacting components, she immediately pushed it aside. But if it had a zipper, or if it was a pullover type sweater or shirt, she sort of took it off the rack for a minute and looked. And then the second thing I noticed was as she put it back on the rack and moved her hand away, there was a slight tremor in her hand. Right? I'm not versed enough in medical science to know exactly what may have been the cause of that or whatever. I didn't ascribe any diagnosis to what I was seeing, but it struck me that the world of clothing might not be accessible for her. And that thought just never, I button shirts, I zip up, I don't, like, it didn't, because it's something that I don't think about, it's something that I don't think about, right? So when we start to consider these ideas around standpoint, our social position, our axiology, our ontology, our epistemology, these are some of the questions I'm asking us to think about. Do we assume, just out of our sort of general, like, what I can do, I assume everybody can do, because it's me, and I can do it, and if I can do it, then everybody can do it. Like, why can't, right? Do we question ourselves that way? Now that's, like I said, relatively benign, a little silly, and maybe a little creepy. Should I be staring at women buying clothes at Ann Taylor? Probably not. But I'm a scientist, my brain does shit like that. Sorry. But what does that mean when I'm operating under the assumption that as a teacher, you are required to speak in front of people, and therefore, if you are reluctant to speak in front of people, you will not be a good teacher. That teachers need to have a commanding voice with the ability to draw people's attention at a moment's notice. And if your voice doesn't carry that kind of gravitas, you can't be a good teacher. One of the reasons all of this went off and has continued to go off is because of critical race theory. I'll ask again, how many of you have heard the term critical race theory? How many of you feel like you could give a pretty succinct definition of what critical race theory is? How many of you are kind of a sort of a maybe? All right. We're not going to go into it because we don't have enough time and because you're not legal theorists and neither am I. Suffice it to say, what's really interesting about the notion of critical race theory and how this pertains to settler colonialism, the reason I'm bringing it in, is for two reasons. One, I've yet to meet a teacher outside of law school. I've yet to meet a teacher that does anything with critical race theory. Right? Nobody in the K-12 school system is teaching case law to any child. And if they are, if you can get a 5-year-old to understand case law, are you kidding? I'm I'm looking at you, live streamers, don't fire them. Nobody's teaching 5th graders or 5-year-olds case law. But what we are doing is we are asking ourselves some really important questions about what kinds of narratives we are sharing with young people. And how this connects to the idea of settler colonial logics is to ask ourselves, for that whole slew of young people that I've been working with for the last 20 some odd years, what do you know about Indigenous people? Answer number 1, nothing. Answer number 2, Trail of Tears. What does that mean? It was bad. Well, what happened? It was a trail, and presumably there were tears on it, and it was bad, right? What responsibility do we have as educators to communicate information, facts, or what's referred to in critical race theory as counter-narratives? What responsibility do we have to share that kind of information with young people? And immediately all kinds of alarm bells and flags start going up. You can't tell young people X things because it's damaging, it's traumatizing, it's not fair to blah, 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 don't do it. Okay, first of all, I watched The Exorcist for the first time when I was 5 years old, and I came out just fine. Don't show 5-year-olds. Does that mean that you need to go into graphic detail explaining the many horrible, wretched crimes of Christopher Columbus? No. And I'm not going to subject anybody here to that right now. Does it mean that we can say things like, Christopher Columbus is a person in history that is both important and complex? Why is he complex? Well, depending on who you ask, he either did great and wonderful things, or he did monstrous, terrible things. What kind of monstrous things? He hurt people. He hurt lots of people for no reason than other than he wanted gold. That doesn't seem very nice to me. And unfortunately, he ushered in a whole entire history of genocide and, okay, we're not going to do that with 5th grade, 5-year-old, right? But you get the point, right? Curiously enough, I'm not going to pick on you because y'all are being so nice to me today. The whole debate and the whole crisis around critical race theory was actually hatched in your backyard. I know how many of you are aware of that. No? Wallace Wells, 2021, it's an article in the New Yorker. I recommend you look at it and read it. Political activist in Seattle decided that he wanted to create a way to vilify all of the conversations that were going on around race, racism, and anti-racism, particularly after the uprisings in Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd. And looking at a number of culturally responsive pedagogy, looking at a number of theories and practices in education and various other disciplines, he started noticing that folks were footnoting critical race theorists like like Derek Bell, like Patricia Williams, like Kimberly Crenshaw. And occasionally would see a notation that included Marx, although that's a little bit of an improper reading, and we won't go into that today. That's the name you're looking for. And I'm not doing this to put Rufo on blast. He doesn't need me to do that. There's plenty of people who already have. But I'm doing that to point out the fact that, once again, our social position, our axiology, our ontology, and our epistemology inform the way we approach how we understand reality. And what Rufo was looking for very intentionally was a way to vilify anti-racism activists. And so he hooked up to this idea of critical race theory, and then he turned it into a talking point. And often when I say that, people look at me sort of strangely, like they envision that I'm in a room with postcards on the wall and push pins and red strings going, smoking a cigarette going, see, I found it. No, he tweeted about this. He was very, very, very upfront, Didn't lie about it, wasn't even trying to hide it. He said, I'm going out of my way to find a villain that I can push to the forefront that will completely derail any conversation. Because I'm willing to acknowledge that there might even be some folks in this room right now who, as soon as I said the words critical race theory, just kind of went. And that's all right. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not attacking anybody. What I am saying is that his work was very effective. Now, how does this come into thinking about colonization, colonialism, and settler colonial logics? When we think about race, racism, particularly as it pertains to indigenous people, there's a really interesting sort of, anybody remember Slinkies? There's a really interesting sort of slinky effect of going back and forth. Right? Because when we think about race, and by the way, in its simplest and most easiest to remember definable terms, race is phenotype. It's the way we look on the outside and how we're perceived. And it's our social information about what we've been told about when we see a particular phenotype. If I see a particular skin color and hair color and texture and particular eye color, I assign that a particular race. Whether that's actually accurate or not, it's kind of irrelevant, right? This is what I've been taught, this is what I've been trained. And how I know this is true is because if I take that exact same person and put them in a different country or in a different nationality, suddenly that racial categorization changes. They are no longer who I think they are because we've changed context. Anyway, all of that is to say that we have this really interesting slinky effect that goes on when we think about indigenous people. We think about them often as racialized people, and then we sort of slinky it back over to politicized people. And that often goes back and forth depending on what's the most effective for us. And by us, I mean mainstream culture and mainstream processes. Case in point. In Arizona, for many years, there was a strong movement by the state legislature to tax indigenous communities that ran casinos, fluctuating depending on who was in charge at the time. But generally, liberal governors and conservative governors were arguing for anything between 10 and 35% of gross revenue from the tribe's gaming operations because they were in Arizona. It's kind of a weird thing when you think about federal government and federal tribal government and the way that governments are supposed to interact. That would be, equivalent to Washington saying we need to tax Japan 35% on whatever it is because, for whatever reason. Right? States don't do that, but Arizona does because Arizona's great. In that respect, the idea of indigenous people as political entities, these groups of people that had this somewhat specialized status because of their enshrinement in the Constitution and in other founding documents, that was, we're not so concerned about that, right? This is really thinking about like a racial issue, the fact that Indian people get to have casinos in Arizona, the rest of Arizona doesn't, that's a racial thing. That's racism actually, that you let Indians have them and no one else does. So in order to make up for that reverse racism that's happening, we're going to tax them at 35%. And I'm glad some people are laughing at that. So we're political beings. We're politicized. We exist as political beings, right? Yeah, because 35%. Okay, all right, fine. Well, part of the, we're racialized beings, right? Because this is a race issue. And our political status as indigenous First Nations people with treaty rights in negotiations with the federal government, like that doesn't really mean anything because this is a racial issue is what you're saying. Okay, all right. We're in need of attention to the treaties that were signed, which means that the state needs to be providing funding for education, for economic development, for health and safety, hold on, that's a federal thing. You're a federally recognized tribe, so you need to handle that with the federal, right? It depends. It depends. When are we a political entity? When are we a racialized entity? It just kind of depends on the convenience of whoever's around. Now, most indigenous folks would say that the racial categories that are placed upon them are irrelevant. Most would say that the national identities that are mapped onto them are largely irrelevant. Most indigenous people would say they are indigenous people. And the closest thing we could possibly map onto them might be ethnic identity, but even that is problematic for a lot of Indigenous folks. But it just kind of depends. What do folks want, when do they want it, and how do they want it is all sort of left up to kind of whoever's in charge at the time and what's important for them. So we can think about a few processes to engage, and this is where I'm going to sort of wind down and also kind of shift us over into some of the work that we'll do in our workshop. The first one is thinking about this standpoint, or what I'm referring to as a critical standpoint examination or a critical standpoint inquiry. And this is based on the work of Walter and Anderson again. Here's the model that I've been explaining, sort of demonstrated graphically. Right? And just replace the word research with teacher or even self, my standpoint. That each of these pieces is in operation in every single one of us at any given moment. Right? And that's another thing that's crucial. That when we talk about these processes of colonization, decolonization, and our attempts to resist some of the logic that's been communicated to us as being real, natural, everybody does it kind of thing, we have to remember that that's all being informed by a particular social position, axiology, ontology, and epistemology. And so how often do we critically examine these things in ourselves? Walter and Anderson tell a funny story about presenting some work at a national conference of statisticians, and how at the end of their presentation, which largely had to do with, I believe it was road safety in Indigenous communities or something like that. They did statistical analysis of like car accidents or something along those lines. And after they were done giving their presentation, a older white male scholar asked them if they would take some time to articulate how their Indigenous identity had an impact on the way they interpreted the results of their statistical analysis. And it struck them both as kind of strange because, again, like, they had never heard that question asked anywhere else except when they were doing the presentation. So for the rest of the conference, they went to as many other panels as they could, and they asked every other single panel presenter if they could talk about how their ethnic identity impacted their analysis of their statistics. And this is telling that every single one of them said, what do you mean? What do you mean? Why would you think that would have an impact on the way I did my analysis? Why would you think it had an impact on the way I did mine, right? The argument is not that they aren't doing it, right? Definitely, Walter and Anderson have a particular perspective and a particular ideology, right? Position, epistemology, axiology, ontology, that's at work in them. It's also at work in you. It's just that oftentimes for marginalized populations and for marginalized communities, that othering is very, very, very present all of the time. So, one of the ways that we can work to understand it and resist some of these processes is we have to know about them. We have to know when our epistemology is being informed by a settler colonial logic. And then we can make a conscious decision, is that something I still want to do? Maybe I don't want to do it. Maybe I want to do it. Okay. Part 2, thinking about equity, inclusion, and justice. If you haven't read Bettina Love's work, highly recommended, just recently made an endowed chair at Teachers College Columbia, renowned scholar, amazing speaker, fiery soul, Bettina Love, all the way. We need to move beyond our conversations about diversity because it is. Right? Or as one of my mentors likes to say, in doing diversity, in doing trainings around equity, inclusion, and justice, he asks crowds, what do you have when you have diversity? Nothing. You have diversity, right? Which has generally been true, with the exception of some places, right? Like, has generally been true for a good amount of time. And frequently, the diversity was present, and it just wasn't spoken of because certain identities were pressured to not identify themselves. Mattering is civics, because it is the quest for humanity. I do not mean civics narrowly defined as voting, paying taxes, and knowing how the government works. Instead, I am referring to something much deeper, rooted in the internal desire we all have for freedom, joy, restorative justice, and to matter to ourselves, our community, our family, and our country. That right there, as a mission statement or as a guiding set of principles to do an analysis or an audit of any piece of curriculum, of any program redevelopment, right? What are we doing that clearly articulates mattering? How do I do that on a daily basis? How do I do that on a minute-to-minute basis as a teacher, as a program, as an institution? Take a second, if you're comfortable with it, to close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Open your eyes as you're comfortable. Take a look around, behind you, look around you. Look at your feet, look under your chair. Last point. Thinking about anti-oppression education. This is the work of Kevin Kumashiro. When we think about this process of examining ourselves, when we're doing this critical inquiry standpoint work, when we're looking at the epistemologies, ontologies, by the way, I should also extend that to say that that standpoint, researcher standpoint could also be teacher standpoint. It could be classroom standpoint, it could be school standpoint, it could be administration standpoint, it could be teacher program standpoint. You can do this analysis of virtually any piece of anything applied to anything anywhere. Right? When we think about anti-oppression education, what Kumashiro reminds us over and over again, and the challenges and the traps that come when we use programs like multicultural education, even culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally sensitive responsive teaching, is that oftentimes that focuses on the other and erases the self. Or to put it another way, if we are members of dominant culture or dominant community, for however you define that, if I'm not doing this critical reflexiveness of looking at myself and questioning myself, then all of the responsibility is put on the other person. And this is where we start to get this identity, or this idea, and I'm not, how do I say this? This is not to say that the idea is entirely wrong, it's often misapplied. When we come into this idea that looking at the other, understanding the other, is what's going to solve the problem, right? The real problem is we need to develop greater empathy in folks. I don't disagree with that, right? I think back to my Ann Taylor experience, right? Having a deeper sense of empathy for folks who, for whatever reason, might only be able to buy certain types of clothes makes me think a little bit differently about what equity is in the clothing world, right? We need to move away from buttons. Maybe we need to start thinking about other ways for, right? Like, I start thinking in a different way. But what that also means is that I have a moment of critically reflecting upon myself. What do I assume about what's real and what isn't? What's true and what's not? What's appropriate and what isn't? Right? Because if I'm not critically examining myself, if I'm putting the responsibility all upon the other, not only am I helping to maintain this idea that there's an other and a me, a self and a them, a this and thou, like this really unfortunate dialectic of information, but at the same time, I never work against my own power and privilege. All I need to do is understand the other better. There's nothing really wrong with me. Side note, there's nothing wrong with me. Right? There's nothing wrong with me. I don't have to check my power and privilege at any point. But what I need to do is continue to develop my understanding of other peoples. I don't disagree with that. I think we do need to continue to develop our understanding of other people. I think we do need to continue to develop our empathy. And by empathy, I don't mean feeling good or bad about something, or even like I feel sorry. Like that's not what I mean by empathy. What I mean by empathy is a complete and total and thorough understanding of another person's positionality, perspective, experience. Right? That's what I mean. There are some pitfalls we have to be careful of. And I've already mentioned two of them, and I'll mention one more. Tuck and Yang, 2012, decolonization is not a metaphor. I both agree and disagree with this position. And I want to say why I disagree with it, but also why I agree with it. By and large, the way that Tuck and Yang defined decolonization is the literal process of colonial removal. You are not decolonizing if you are not returning the land to the people who it belonged to. That is decolonization. If you're not doing that, you're not decolonizing. I was studying and learning at a time when Linda Tuihai Smith, Decolonizing Methodology, some of you might be familiar with it, powerful, powerful voice in decolonization, powerful, powerful voice in feminist theory, talked about how processes of decolonization with the Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, were a function of helping folks, both Maori and non-Maori folks in New Zealand, understand these colonial logics. Understanding how our history teaching, our education processes, our assumptions about civic engagement and civic duty, our assumptions about the political, economic discourse, everything that was going on was constantly reteaching these beliefs and understandings about who gets to participate and who doesn't, who's legitimate and who isn't, what knowledge is real and what knowledge is not real. Right? Really focusing on this idea of legitimacy. I happen to think it's both and. But the reason I bring up Tuck and Yang's critique is because, as related to the multicultural critique, frequently when we talk about decolonization or anti-settler colonialism or however we decide to frame it, we often defer to, in some ways, the safest manifestation of this. Right? And by safest, I'm putting us collectively, and by us collectively I'm talking about teachers, those of us who maintain some of these power spaces within classrooms. I'm putting us on blast right now. That sometimes what we do is we go for the safest route that keeps us the most comfortable. And so our decolonial process or our decolonial practice can sometimes turn into a kind of a benign multiculturalism, right? A kind of a benign showing of support. That doesn't really require any self-critique and also doesn't really require any community engagement or community understanding. I had a school ask me one time to help them develop a land acknowledgement. And they said, we've just been hearing about them, we really don't know much about them, we're really interested in developing a land acknowledgement, and we heard you could help. And I said, let's talk, I'm happy to have this conversation with you. I should point out though that I might point to some really uncomfortable things for you that you may not like. For example, why are you doing a land acknowledgement in the first place? Well, to acknowledge the indigenous people. Yeah, what's going on that you need to acknowledge the indigenous people? Are they not there? We will know. Oh, they're not. Where are they? We don't know. Might be a good idea to find out. Okay. So let's say you do get land acknowledgement, let's say you get involved with community to develop this land acknowledgement, and what if as part of the process of this land acknowledgement, the community tells you they want it back? Are you willing to give it back? If you're not willing to give it back, are you willing to come to some sort of communal understanding of how you will be utilizing the land and providing some kind of reparation for the land? There's a community in Oakland. It's not required, but they do occasionally send out an email reminding the residents of the land that is indigenous to them that they owe them property taxes for the year. And you can go into the website of this community, type in how much rent or mortgage you pay, and calculate your yearly property tax to the community and pay them accordingly. It's not required, but you could do it. If it had been me, if I had been living there, I would have owed them $72 this year. But I asked them, what are you going to be willing to do? What process are you willing to undertake? What are you going to do? And they didn't have an answer. And they didn't call me back. To be thoughtful and to be careful about how we consider enacting these processes, how we consider when we think about identifying colonialism, settler colonial processes in our teaching, in our schools, in our institutions, in our ways of being, identifying them, potentially deciding to disrupt them in the ways that we decide we're going to disrupt them, and how are we moving towards that disruption being authentic and useful for the communities that we are supposed to acknowledge. to close, I want to quote one of my favorite hip-hop artists, Brother Ali. He's from Minneapolis. He has a line in a song called Uncle Sam Goddamn, where he says, I know that we're in trouble, and I ain't scared to tell you because I love you. When we think about these kinds of processes, and I'm coming to you sort of taking my standpoint, my epistemology, ontology, and axiology, and kind of just throwing it at you. I'm doing this from a place of deep love and deep respect. That I want us, as educators and as community members, apparently the sky agrees with me, as educators and community members, to really be thinking about what we're doing, what informs our actions and our activities, and whether or not those actions or activities are the ones that are going to best serve the communities that we are a part of. And when we think about being in the midst of this ongoing settler colonial project, whether that's happening through economics, whether that's happening through politics, whether that's happening through land acquisition, in whatever form it's happening, are we doing our best to recognize it, understand it, question it, critique it, and are we questioning and critiquing our own power and privilege within those spaces? Thanks, everybody. Got a little bit of time for questions. I would also recommend folks stand up and stretch a little bit. But I'm happy to respond to questions, thoughts, reflections, concerns, preoccupations. No debates, though, that's extra. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Electra Gupton. I'm the Director of Student Life here at KSCC. So my lens, thank you for allowing me to be here every
Yeah.
by the
Thanks
way.
for coming.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
So my lens of education is a little different because I kind of do like the outside of the classroom education, but being able to tie back to what students are learning in the classroom and things like that.
Right.
I just had a question because you were talking about multiculturalism. In student affairs, that's a word that's used and coined very often.
Yeah.
It's like, multicultural affairs, multicultural student programs, and things like that. So what would be your suggestion from like your lens and kind of the work that you do of like maybe changing that terminology or being able to really be more expansive and intentional of like the communities that you're working with under that multicultural umbrella, if that makes sense?
It does. Yeah, I personally don't mind the terminology of multiculturalism because much like I don't have problems with multicultural education except as it's been rolled out. Right? And what often ends up happening in spaces like the multicultural student offices is that it just becomes a sort of a quick hand for, is it brown people? Send them to the multicultural, like they'll take care, that's a brown people issue, go do that, right? As sort of an unfortunate anecdote, Tucson Unified School District, where I used to work, had a robust office of multicultural student affairs that took up an entire floor of one building with multiple employees to serve African communities, African American communities, Asian. After a number of budget cuts and one of the worst governors we've ever had in the history of mankind, it was reduced down to one office, and it was literally the office of multicultural student affairs. And the running joke was, send him to the brown guy office. And ironically, it was a brown guy who was running the office, right? So I don't necessarily see it as an issue or as a problem, so long as there's clarity around what it actually represents. Right? The second thing, and this is also something to be very mindful of for the folks who work for those offices, is that there is part of the reason why I don't care about the term diversity so much anymore is because of the presence of diversity no matter what. Within those individual communities, within the multicultural student complex, there's far more diversity within the individual group than there is across differences of the two groups. So that is to say that you'll see more diversity within African American community than you'll see between African American community and Latinx community, as one example, right? So part of what we want to be careful with is what can happen when we condense down that terminology, right? And thinking and paying very close attention to students are communicating to you as well, right? Like how are students feeling about being referred to as the multicultural student offices or multicultural student affairs? Does that serve them? I don't, again, I don't see it as a problem in so much as it maintains its robustness and it maintains its nuance, if that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have an answer? Oh.
I would like to say thank you for the whole thing on land acknowledgement. Hopefully certain people on campus see this. I was involved in creating what we have now. And I tried very hard to get stolen land put in there, colonizer put in there, and I was told that that was too divisive and we did not want to portray that image here. So thank you for that. Thank you for you reading the one that you read, because that's more in line with what I was pushing for.
Sure.
So I
Thank you
hope
for your work on
that
that.
others involved in
Appreciate it.
creating
Thank you
that
for
are
your work on
watching
that.
this.
I would love it at some point in the future where the stigma of things like settler or even racist go away. Like at this point in time, many folks, particularly white identified folks, would say the worst thing you could do would be to call them a racist, right? And to like make it so public that everybody acknowledges like, oh, that person's a racist, right? Like, that is the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. It is bad, right? Like that's not, what could happen to a person's career, to their family, like that's horrible, horrible stuff. But we live in a racist society. We operate in a white supremacist society. We operate in a heteronormative patriarchal society. And the sooner I acknowledge that, and the sooner I'm aware of that, then I can begin to do that critical reflective process. Hey, you're a racist. You're right, I was born in the US. Now let's get to work. We've got things to do, right? As opposed to a lot of the defending that go, I am not a racist. I have, you know, whatever lineage you decide to draw that proves your lack of non-racist, whatever it is, like, I don't care. We were born here, we were raised here, it's in the water, it's in the air, it's in everything. Take a deep breath, acknowledge it, now let's get to work. Thank you for that work, I appreciate that. Yeah?
Hi, I'm John, I'm a music professor here. Would you say this is why some people gravitate towards sort of right-wing conservative platforms and stuff, because it's easier for them not to acknowledge the flaws and the constructs in which they thrived and grew up in the United States? You know, they've got these people over here confirming that America's awesome, and you know.
So that's a tough one, because there's two reasons why that's a hard one to answer.
Sure.
One is, or at least for me, there's two reasons why that's a hard one to answer. Like Thomas King said, right, you now can't go away and say I would have lived my life differently if I hadn't heard that story, because I just told it to you. So in my experience with the at the end Taylor story, right, I don't think it was necessarily, it was certainly a place of privilege, right, because I don't have to think about any kind of dexterity in terms of my hands to button things, right? Like I don't have to think about that, so it's a privilege that I don't have to think about that. There's a certain power in not having to think about that. I don't think I was actively going out of my way to use that power and privilege to necessarily demean or hurt people that aren't able to button things for whatever reason. But the fact that I have that privilege and I wasn't thinking about it is a point, that's an important point for me to attend to. So the reason I say that is because within whatever mindset, whether it's liberal, conservative, or anything in between, or anything outside of that binary, if that's your conception of reality, then not having that conception of reality, like I can't think about something you can't think about, right? Like you can't, like it's an insane thought exercise to try to figure out, like, and so when I think about where folks gravitate to or what folks sort of connect to, I try to think a little bit about what is the axiology, ontology, what is the social positioning that sets up this idea for you that this belief that you have makes sense, is normal, is natural, is regular, and that anything else outside of that is sort of deviant in some way. So that's one reason why. You can't think of something you can't think of, right? The second reason, related to the idea that you can't think of something you can't think of, is if what is communicated to you over the span of your lifetime, that particular perspectives, particular ideas, particular concepts of reality are the ones that are correct and right, we often don't stop to think about when they're not correct or right. Like we get so accustomed to think, how many of you drove here today in a car and you were the driver? How many of you were the driver? Okay. Did you, while you were driving over here, did you at any point in your process of driving go, man, I really hope my brake works today? Like right? It wasn't in your, the brake always works. Now that's messed up because now you're going to be thinking about the brakes. I'm sorry, I apologize, right? But when the thing is the thing, we don't think about it. We don't put a whole lot of thought into it. And so part of some of the work that I ask teachers to engage in is this critical standpoint inquiry, is to begin to look at some of those things. So if you fully and are thoroughly connected to the idea that depending on which community you ask, you'll hear a different answer as to who's responsible. I've heard Cherokee, I've heard Cree, I've heard a couple of other ones, right? That an elder told the story about, I'm no longer interested in freedoms, I'm interested in my obligations. Right? The discourse around what I am free to do and what I have the right to do doesn't interest me anymore. What I'm interested in is what are my obligations to my community. And if in your mind it's been inculcated in you that what you are responsible for is upholding your freedoms and your rights, right? That's how it goes back to that, you can't think of what you can't think about. If you haven't been introduced to the story or introduced to the idea that maybe there's something else to attend to besides your personal freedoms and your personal rights, I could get mad at you for not doing it, but it's not really a good use of my time. And again, I'll just hey, here's the thing, now let's move on. If you don't want to move on, that's a different conversation, right? But I've run into more than my fair share of folks who are adhering to whatever political agenda that they're adhering to, and are doing it because that's what they like, that's what they want, that it works for them. So yeah, it's hard to say, it's hard to talk about motivations, or it's hard to talk about a crystal clear decision making, because I think often we don't, always, regardless of what our political denomination is. So the only thing I can do that I feel is responsible and effective is I will share this story with you, and now you can't say you didn't hear this story before. Thanks, John. Yeah.
So as white educators, I know it's important to always be thinking about who you're doing the work with, but on a daily basis with your students, how do you share that story in a responsible way, in an appropriate way?
Yeah, and I would add to going back to the other critique, right? The self and other, the questions around diversity. These ideas often come to the forefront in our mind when the other is represented directly, immediately, right? I need to start thinking about critical race theory because I have black kids in my classroom now. Oh boy. I would argue that you need to think twice as hard about it when they're not in your classroom, right? That you need to be giving very, very deep thought to what kinds of material, what kinds of information, what kind of lessons you're bringing about indigeneity, even if you never see an indigenous kid in your classroom that you know of, right? Because they might be there and they may not self-identify. Or they may be there and they may not even know that they're indigenous, right? Or they may be there and they're indigenous but they have no connection to their community, whatever, keep going. Or there are no indigenous students at all. And that's when it can be challenging because we get really comfortable thinking oh, there's no diversity here, so I don't really have to think about diversity responsive pedagogy because there's no diversity here. That's arguably when you need to think about it twice as hard because you're helping to perpetuate the next group of people who start to have thoughts about any. And we already have tons of empirical, go back to the Duke doll experiments. We already have tons of empirical knowledge about how young people, little, 2, 3-year-olds are already framing their understanding of which race is good, which race is bad, which identity is good, which identity is bad. So if they're already formulating those ideas, if you have the opportunity to engage those ideas with them at whatever age you can, you gotta do it. Even if the particular diversity that you're thinking about is not represented there. Arguably even more so. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions or anything else, but thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.